I'm Nancy Chanteau, and today I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about grief. I have had a number of people come through my office in the last few days struggling with big losses, usually some kind of death or disease of loved ones. Um, and one of the things that I notice right away that happens when people are struggling with grief, and there's this period of time right after we get a big the information about grief where we're just in shock. And during that time, it's really important to just do the best we can to get through it, to take care of ourselves as much as possible. Um, Oftentimes, that shock period, uh, trying to intervene in any way with it is not very self compassionate. So we just want to kind of nurture ourselves as much as possible and do what we can. Uh, Spoon theory from the disability movement is this idea that the energy that we need to live our lives, can be measured in terms of spoons. That so a daily task like uh, taking a shower or making a meal, that those tasks can actually take quite a bit of energy when we don't have very much. And if we don't have the spoons to do a task, we won't be able to do it. So one of the things about having limited spoons, having a limited amount of energy in a day, and this would be true of shock, is that we actually have to make sure that we have the spoons for the things we absolutely mandatorily need to do. So one of the things, and when we're in shock, oftentimes we know that we need to call in and tell people that we can't work and that we need to stay home or do the minimum. Oftentimes there's a period after that where we still might not have the energy to do kind of ordinary activities that are optional, and yet we try and do them, and we end up using up the energy that we have to heal or recover, doing things that maybe aren't that important. So one of the things I like to help people do is to assess how much energy do they have, how much spoons do they have for the activities that they have to do, and then make decisions about what to do with any spoons that they have for any stretch. And one of the things that happens when we're grieving is that we often really focus on the feeling of powerlessness. The loss is something that we don't have any control over. A diagnosis, or somebody's dead or dying, some sort of tragedy, whatever is happening, and this could be the loss of relationship as well as a loss of a person to mortality. And whatever is going on, whatever that loss is, the grieving process can get intertwined with a feeling that we should have done something. There's the feeling of powerlessness makes us feel like we should somehow have been able to fix it. And when we focus on trying to fix our feelings of powerlessness, we often will direct our attention either inward in a shame move where there's something wrong with me, or outward in a blame move, there's something wrong with someone else. Somebody did something wrong. And while it might be true that somebody did something wrong, it's often also true that we're powerless, and that putting that attention on who did what wrong may or may not have anything to do with the situation changing, and is very energetically draining. So one of the things that we can begin to do as we practice skills for change is to accept the unacceptable about our circumstances. Accept that whatever has happened to us is unacceptable, that trying to make somebody wrong in order to have some power over the circumstances is probably not true, and that act of trying to make somebody wrong is actually life-draining. And when we stop doing that, when we accept the unacceptable, that we're powerless, or that we feel powerless over the circumstance, if there's something that we can do, it often shows up. And often the kinds of things that we can do are things in terms of our response. We can take care of ourselves. We can be self-compassionate. We can ask for help or give help. We can work on healing and recovery. We might find that enacting our routine is helpful. Taking a walk or getting some exercise is helpful. And these things also might not be helpful. And this self-observation of tracking ourselves watching what happens. Is an activity draining or replenishing? Those kinds of activities can be really useful to guide us in the direction of what is it that we need right now, what would help us deal with the situation as it is. And, oftentimes it will feel like nothing helps. And then if that's the case, being able to assess that that's true and do something that doesn't add. So it might be just sitting quietly or watching some program or listening to a book that is life affirming. And what is life affirming to us in those circumstances is completely unique and individual to us. So we're becoming very good self observers, and in our self love, caring for ourselves, giving ourselves the thing that is helpful, or not doing things that aren't helpful. Sometimes doing nothing will take less energy than doing something, even though we think we should. And sometimes we think doing something will exhaust us, and so we avoid it and then don't get the benefit of it. So we're really trying to put on our objective observing hats, locating ourselves in our embodied wise adult consciousness, and then from there making choices, observing ourselves, and then making choices again. So if we can manage our spoons and our depletion, and stop trying to shame or blame ourselves, stop responding to our powerlessness as if somebody did something wrong, then we're left with acceptance. And once we are actually embodying and practicing accepting the unacceptable, oftentimes we can start to design a different way to relate to our experience. And that can sound like it's really far away to people who are really lost in grief. When people are lost in grief, we don't need to do the third or fourth step out. We just do what's right in front of us. So you could hit stop on this video, go and start the processes of figuring out your spoons, figuring out your depletion, stopping the shaming and blaming response to powerlessness, and inside of that, being gentle with yourself, and come back and work on the redesign of consciousness later. If you're further along in the grief process and you feel ready to start looking at what are the stories that I'm holding about myself, about the world, about this person, or about this loss that are life-draining versus the stories that are life-affirming, we can tell if something is life-draining by how it makes us feel. So you can kind of notice what the thoughts are. What are the thoughts that are recurring when we are struggling with grief? And write them down. And then we can start to categorize them. Do these thoughts turn inward? Because they could be this shame, blame response. We call it, in Skills for Change, we call it pig. This could be a pig response in disguise. Or it could be something about a story that we're holding about the world, where that story somehow is disempowering in some way. And if we were to really look at, do we know whether or not that story, the way that we're holding it, is true, the likelihood is that these big stories about life, the real truth is that we're dealing with the unknown. So then, if it were possible to just accept the fact that the real truth is unknown for you or for whoever this is, we would ideally be able to work with our relationship with the unknown and become to accepting the unacceptable about that. And it can be really helpful if we don't have any way to verify the validity of our story. Why not make up a story that helps us feel better? Why not make up a story that helps us feel lighter or helps us relax? And oftentimes what I find is that the stories that are most relaxing are the stories that feel the most true. And the stories that feel the most true tend to be non-dualistic. They tend to, rather than being about right or wrong, good or bad, where there's one or the other, the stories tend to be right and wrong. So right for me, right for you, wrong for me, wrong for you, depending on the context and the circumstances. And something that's right for me right now could be wrong for me in an hour. And so therefore, I come back to this place of design. What works best for me, observing myself, starting to organize myself towards a path and a process and a belief system that takes care of me. And finally, we want to work with the body. We want to desensitize as much as possible any kinds of tension or anxiety or trauma in our bodies, and to do that with a practice that's a combination of intentional, where we're deciding to do it. We know what its purpose is. We know what result we're aiming for. We're doing it with intensity. So we need to make sure we're doing something that has a bodily physicality to it rather than something. Sometimes just sitting and being quiet and breathing can be sufficiently intense, and sometimes it's not. We sometimes need to increase the intensity of the practice, and that's, again, a self-observing, try an intense practice, try a less intense practice, and see what works best for you. And then finally, we need to do something with repetition, because it takes 300 repetitions to get something new into muscle memory and 3,000 to change from one thing to another. So we're working on this process of doing the activities of accepting the unacceptable, and I just summarized those activities in the context of grief and loss, working with the event as it is, working with what's happening right now and doing the best we can with our energy, with our spoon theory, identifying. We can also work with the depletion scale and identify where we are in depletion, and focus on getting replenished, focus on getting ourselves from the negatives, from -10 to 0 up above to 0 or above, by doing replenishing activities and by calling in wretched to the optional activities in our life. We can focus on stopping the shame-blame response, stopping the pig response to powerlessness, identifying when we feel powerless, and then noticing when we're trying to figure out how to fix it by either making ourselves wrong or making others wrong. We can work on replacing our life-draining beliefs with life-affirming beliefs. And finally, we can work on desensitizing our bodies so that our bodies are able to release instead of hold on to the tension that. And oftentimes, like I said, when we have that shame-blame response, the tension will get kind of the grieving process. We can cry and cry, but it just feels like it builds up in the body rather than releasing. So we're looking for the ability to do release practices, grieving practices that help us actually release in the body. And sometimes it will take intensity, and repetition in order to do that. So I hope this has been helpful. Thanks very much, and please leave me a comment or a suggestion or a question if you'd like some further response or explanation.